Week 7 of the college baseball rankings is here. Let's jump into it. And the top 5 was probably relatively easy, but after that, it is just a mess. But starting off, still with LSU number 1, pretty easy claim for that. Passes every test so far, and just even though Tennessee won by a decent margin on Sunday, it was a high score game from both sides, even though Tennessee put up a big number on LSU. They just keep winning series against really good SEC teams, and they probably have had one of the more challenging SEC conference resume so far, but they just keep passing every single test.
Yeah, I mean LSU's dominance up to this point has been extremely impressive, and like you mentioned, when you take into consideration the competition they've been playing as well, it puts things into perspective how good this team is. And yeah, it's just like Tennessee was last year, Arkansas the year before. Just a team that is utterly dominating the regular season. We'll see if they're able to hold on throughout the entire year.
Yeah, there might be a little bit of a potentially problem with their Sunday starts with just giving up a decent amount of runs a lot of the time, but right now they're dominating a lot of the games, so it's tough to look too far into that right now. But after that, Wake Forest still at number 2, went 4-0, swept Clemson at Clemson, and they just keep the ball rolling. Very balanced offense and pitching. So this team is looking like the class of the ACC right now.
Yeah, they're very hot, and right behind them had Vandy, who same thing, also playing extremely well. Also went 4-0 on the week, swept Georgia, who seemed to be pretty decent this year. They were a fringe top 25 team for us for a while, but never really had that prove it series win. And yeah, Vandy's continuing to dominate as well.
Yeah, Georgia's tumbling down once play started. But yeah, Vandy just offense is continuing to stay hot and staying in that 3 spot right above Florida, who even though only had 3 games, went 2-1 against Auburn, lost the Friday game, but was able to bounce back and really dominated the next 2 games after that, putting up a lot of runs. So yeah, it's kind of Florida's resume so far. They just keep the offense looks really good. Pitching staff is decent it seems, and really a lot of these SEC teams, the top SEC teams are just dominating a lot of these other mid-level SEC.
Yeah, it looked like Florida may be in danger there for a bit on Sunday. About halfway through the game, they were down a couple runs, but they just poured it on to end that game and ended up winning pretty handedly. So got that series win, and yep, kept them in the 4 spot there.
Yeah, so all those previous teams stayed in the same spot. At number 5, though, last week we had Virginia, and that spot I think opened up because they went 2-2 and lost the weekend series at Virginia Tech, little rivalry series. So I don't think you can put too much weight on it, especially because this is their first series loss of the year so far. So can't dock them too hard in my opinion, but definitely for me personally, had Arkansas jumping back up in the rankings to number 5 now after going 3-1 on the week and beating an Alabama team on the weekend that has just been right outside the top 25 for it seems like most of the season now. They were in the top 25 for a little bit, and now they're just continually going 2-2 each week and seeming like they lose the weekend series when they face good competition. So right on the outside looking in still, but yeah, Arkansas is able to bounce back after losing to LSU last week and won this close series.
Yeah, I also had Arkansas in this 5 spot here. Got that series win over Bama, and then, like you mentioned, hard to drop Virginia too far in these rankings just because it was a rivalry series. It was against a quality opponent, and just tons of these teams in like the 6 through 15 range went 2-2 on the week. Not a lot of teams were super impressive, and no teams are going to be like plummeting down either. So I had Arkansas in that 5 spot, and then Virginia following it back up in the 6.
Yeah, so I went a little bold here with South Carolina jumping Virginia as well, just because I think South Carolina is finally starting to put a decent resume together. Look, they still haven't faced the top competition in the SEC, but they've passed the test so far. and 26-3. You can't really look past that. And Virginia has a little bit worse of a record now. They still are pretty up there, but yeah, I think South Carolina has just slowly deserved to creep up the rankings. And finally, there was a week where a lot of teams didn't do the best, so I think they definitely are able to capitalize here. But yeah, I had Virginia right after that at number 7, so I could see it either way. I just kind of want to reward South Carolina for just the amazing consistency they've had. And we did have them at 10 last week, but I think the opportunity is there for them to jump all the way up to 6 here.
Yeah, I don't mind that at all. I was going back and forth on whether I wanted South Carolina or Virginia in that spot, and I ended up giving Virginia the nod, but I'm totally fine with South Carolina there. Like we said, they've been playing extremely well and continue to just take care of business in this SEC play, so I'm fine with rewarding them there in that 6th spot.
Sweet. Yeah, and I think after the like 6-7 of South Carolina, Virginia, it just doesn't seem like there are. I feel like there's a decent gap to the next level right now. It just seems like those are the teams that have consistently been able to just get after it and kind of started the season in the rankings and just proved that they deserve to be ranked. And after that, it's really just complicated to figure out where teams slot in. For me, I had Boston College jumping all the way up to 8 from 15 last week. They just continue to win weekends, 3-1 on the week, and yeah, haven't lost a weekend yet. And with other ACC teams struggling this week, they can definitely take advantage of that. And now they're pushing for that number 2 ACC spot.
Yeah, I had Boston College in my 9 spot, so pretty close there. I had Stanford right above them. They didn't have a great week, split with Oklahoma on the road there. Uh, but yeah, I was going back and forth on that one as well. Boston College, similar to South Carolina, just continues to win every weekend and don't have like super notable series wins, although they have more than South Carolina at this point, but just a team that we weren't expecting to be this good when the year started. So kind of hard to move them up a lot, but we certainly are now.
Yeah, so I dropped Stanford a little bit more just because I don't know, I haven't been super impressed with them overall. I mean, their record kind of shows that at 18-7. Even though they outscored Oklahoma by 20 runs over the weekend, they went 2-2 against them, so that's pretty brutal. You really got to take advantage of the close games. They weren't able to win those, and the other two they just kind of blew them out of the water. But yeah, it's tough to see that. And around that area, I also have like the likes of Kentucky and Tennessee. Not too sure about Kentucky, not like super sold on them, but they're 25-3. And that record kind of speaks for itself. And, they keep winning SEC series now after that sweep on who we did have a ranked Missouri team last week. And that's pretty impressive considering what Missouri was able to do a few weeks ago against Tennessee. So kind of that's the reason why I had Kentucky over Tennessee was because of the like mutual opponent that they had, and Kentucky was just able to kind of dominate while Tennessee got swept. So it's like the complete opposite flip of a coin there.
Yeah, I also have both Kentucky and Tennessee in this area as well. I had Tennessee ahead of Kentucky just because I have more faith in Tennessee overall. But like you said, with Kentucky's overall record right now, it's very good. And they do have that common opponent victory over Missouri, like you mentioned as well. So yeah, I mean this part of the rankings is just very mixy with a lot of teams having average weeks and then moving a
Yeah.
couple teams in this area as well.
Yeah, it really is a mess. I don't know. It's so hard to figure out which teams go where. This was just like my first instincts, and I was like, all right, I'm leaving. I'm leaving, writing it in pen and just letting it sit and just forgetting about it once I have this done because I do not want to think about this any more than I need to. But here we are talking about it. So yeah, it's a toughie. So after Boston College at 8, we have the 9, 10, 11 spots between Stanford, Kentucky, and Tennessee. I have Kentucky, Tennessee, Stanford, and you have Stanford, Tennessee, Kentucky. So
Yep.
just the complete flip flop. We love that. We love that. Yeah, I don't know. It's tough. I just don't want to like drop. I feel like Tennessee deserves to drop. We both have them dropping one spot from 9 to 10, even though we have the other order different. But, you know, you kind of expect a 2-2 week from them. They beat UNC Asheville in the midweek, and then going to number one LSU and getting one game off of them is kind of just what you expect out of this Tennessee that we've seen so far this season. Obviously, they'd like to have won that series. That would have done an amazing thing for their resume. But yeah, for me, I mean, yeah, I can't see dropping them too far past 10 or 11. I feel like we can put them at the end of those three, but I'm not sure if I necessarily think Stanford deserves to be in front of Tennessee, especially after this past week. Going against a very average Oklahoma team so far this season. Obviously, you never know how things end out, but they have looked very, very average this year, and going 2-2 against them is, I'd say, worse than getting one game against LSU.
Yeah.
And we had them pretty close, and their overall record is relatively similar.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I have more faith in Tennessee at this point. I think Stanford is a very suspect top 10 team. Like you mentioned, just haven't been overly impressed with them, but they just haven't really had like the bad series losses or anything to move them down a lot besides that
That's
one
true.
weekend against USC. So that's why they've kind of hung around in this area. Uh, but yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, I would honestly be fine with leaving Tennessee in the 9 spot as well, just because I do think going into the week you're hoping for 2-2, and they did that. They just lost a series to the number one team in the country. That's been by far the number one team in the country up to this point. So, like you mentioned, you really can't drop them far at all.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely reasonable. Um, where would you feel comfortable putting Stanford? Because I don't know. I feel like we could put Tennessee, Kentucky, Stanford, um, something like that.
That would be
But
good with me.
or Stanford, Kentucky. I don't really have too much of an opinion, especially because Kentucky's that big riser that has proven a lot so far, but hasn't faced the like top competition in the SEC so far. But that will be coming soon, so there will be a lot to prove there. And yeah, I don't know.
I say we just go Tennessee, Kentucky, Stanford, and
Okay,
I think Kentucky and Stanford will sort themselves out in the coming weeks as they continue to play tougher competition.
sounds good. Tennessee, Kentucky, Stanford from 9 to 11. And then for the 12 spot, I went with Campbell. They had a good week, went 3-1. Didn't really face anybody, but considering a lot of the teams from like 10 to 15 really struggled or went 2-2 or something like that, I think that they're able to rise to a spot like this for sure.
Yeah, I had them in the 15 spot for me.
Nice.
Um, yeah, no, this was like a tough area because, like we mentioned earlier, there's just a lot of teams that had 2-2 weeks, and
Yep.
so that this is where I slotted in 3 of those teams ahead of Campbell here. I had
Okay.
I had Oklahoma State moving up,
Mhm.
went 2-2 on the week, but had a series win over Texas. Was a good series, and then I had North Carolina, who also 2-2, but had a series win over Notre Dame on the weekend, and then followed that up with Louisville, who has now lost 2 weekends in a row and definitely deserves to drop a bit. But do still have some faith in that team. I think they're solid, and it wasn't a bad NC State team that they lost to. I personally have NC State moving into the rankings this week. I think they're a solid club. Uh, but yeah, those are the 3 teams I had ahead of Campbell here.
Nice. Well, we don't have all the same teams in the rankings this week then, if that's the case, because I did not bring in NC State, but I did have Louisville in the 13th. I had Louisville, UNC, Oklahoma State from 13 to 15. So I just had Campbell in front of all those teams, while you had Campbell right behind him. So at least we know that order from Louisville to Oklahoma State. But yeah, I just thought, I don't know. I really don't like moving teams up in the rankings going 2-2. I feel like that's just like a brutal thing to happen. I mean, it's definitely reasonable considering some teams doing like all right, like North Carolina, going to Notre Dame and winning the series, but they lost their like one good game against Coastal Carolina since Coastal's ranked and Notre Dame is looks like they're having a down year, like we've mentioned previously. Uh, so yeah, that was just the call that I made there, just bringing Campbell up, kind of following the path of Kentucky.
Yeah, it's tough because I wanted to leave North Carolina in the same spot. I didn't want to drop them for
Right.
winning a series, and then there being other just kind of like borderline teams around them. And
Yeah.
then the reason I put Oklahoma State ahead of them was I did think that was a really solid series win over Texas.
Yeah.
Texas was extremely hot heading into that, but at the end of the day, it was a 2-2 week also, so it's
Yeah, and
tough.
they got crushed by DBU in the midweek, which is a
Yeah.
midweek game, but you got to get those wins when you have that opportunity. And DBU is a pretty decent midweek opponent that you really wish to get that game from them.
And
Okay.
I feel like Louisville should be at the back of this group just because they've
Yeah,
lost
we
2
can do
series
that.
in a row.
We can definitely do that. I had them in the front, but I wasn't super confident with that, especially with back-to-back weekend losses. So we can do that. So now it's just a matter of UNC, Oklahoma State, which I'm fine with flip-flopping Oklahoma State, like Oklahoma State going in front of UNC. But I don't know. I just feel like Campbell, I feel like they should hold their ground and move up to that number 12 spot.
That's fine with me. We can go Campbell, Oklahoma State, UNC, Louisville.
Sure. Yeah, that works. From 12 to 15, Campbell, Oklahoma State, UNC, Louisville, with Oklahoma State rising one spot. All right, and that 16 spot, this is where I dropped East Carolina. They went 1-3 on the week, lost their midweek, and then also lost the weekend series at Houston, which is a pretty dreadful week considering it wasn't the best competition, and East Carolina has to take advantage of like the bad teams like that to be able to stay in a good spot in the rankings, and they weren't able to do that. But luckily, it came in a week where a lot of teams didn't do the best, so I felt like, I don't know, they got a bit lucky not dropping too far down. But there's definitely a lot of other teams in that mix that we could argue for.
Yeah, I had Florida Gulf Coast in this 16 spot.
Okay.
They didn't have a super impressive week, just a 2-1 series win. But the teams I had kind of in this mix here were Florida Gulf Coast, both UCLA and ECU dropping down, and then I was potentially considering putting Coastal ahead of this group, but I didn't. But they were in the mix for me.
Yep.
Uh, Personally, for me, I like UCLA ahead of East Carolina still, just because they were ahead of them, and they both just had bad weeks. 0-3 for UCLA, 1-3 for ECU, and I think UCLA, although it was an 0-3 week, it is tough playing up in Pullman when it's snowing the whole weekend as well. So it's a tough weekend. I feel like they get not like a bye for that, but like a little bit of a little graciousness in the dropping there,
Yeah,
keeping
the
them ahead
Cali
of East
boys can't
Carolina.
take the weather.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
can't take that snow. But I have that like same group of East Carolina, Florida Gulf Coast, Coastal, and UCLA from 16 to 19, just a different order than what you said. But the only reason, so I dropped UCLA all the way down to that 19 spot, and the main reason is because they're now 0-5 in their last 5 games, so they're five straight losses. And sure, it's tough to play in Pullman when the weather's like that, but you know that's on your schedule and you kind of got to deal with it. And other teams will probably have relatively similar things with bad weather here and there. And yeah, UCLA just hasn't looked the sharpest recently, and you know that's kind of the opportunity for these mid-major teams to like jump a team like UCLA. So yeah, I have East Carolina, Florida Gulf Coast, Coastal, then UCLA. So I mean, I'm fine probably moving Florida Gulf Coast up to 16 and dropping East Carolina like one spot lower down. But yeah.
Yeah, I would be up for that, and so Florida Gulf Coast, East Carolina, Coastal, UCLA.
Yep. From 16 to 19, those are the teams. And then from 20 to 25, this is where I think, both are introducing three new teams into the rankings, and it sounds like some of them are not the same. But the teams that I left in from last week, so as it stands, the teams we had left from last week are Iowa, Texas, Texas Tech, Missouri, and Texas A&M, if I'm correct. Those were the teams that were all in the rankings last
and
week.
and Santa Barbara.
Yes, and UCSB. They also had a bad week. And the teams that I dropped were Iowa, Missouri, and Texas A&M. We had Missouri and Texas A&M at 24-25, and they both had average to below average weeks, so it's just not enough to stay in the rankings for me, but I think it's up for debate, potentially Iowa and UCSB, with them being a little bit higher, but not having good weeks as well.
Yeah, I dropped both Santa Barbara and Iowa, as well as Missouri.
Okay.
Yeah, both Santa Barbara and Iowa just had tough weeks. Didn't think they really played well enough to keep their way in. And then these other teams at the bottom, they didn't have terrible weeks. So I felt like they just deserved to stay in more than those guys, even though they were a little ahead of them. And
Sure.
so in the 20 spot, for me, man, this was tough, but I went with I went with Texas Tech because they had
Wow.
the series win over TCU. So I
Uh-huh.
moved them up a couple spots, but can't say I feel good about it whatsoever.
Yeah, especially so both Texas and Texas Tech went 2-2 on the week with yeah, like you mentioned, Texas Tech winning their weekend series against TCU but losing to New Mexico in the midweek, and then Texas going 2-2, beating who we have or had at number 25 Texas A&M in the at Texas A&M, and then losing the series at Oklahoma State. So went on the road and went 2-2. That's kind of, I don't know. That's not a bad week for sure. They were hot. They weren't able to keep all that momentum there, but yeah, they for me and you, we both had them still in the rankings there. But I think it's just a decision of how things kind of pan out. But what were the teams that you brought in?
Yeah, I brought in Miami, Oregon, and NC State.
Okay. I brought in Miami, Oregon, and West Virginia. So similar, just one off. So for those teams, Miami, just looking back, we probably shouldn't have dropped them out last week, even though we had them pretty far down there in the rankings. Their kind of opposition stands alone as one of like the kind of toughest records in the NCAA right now. And they went 4-0 this past week, swept Florida State, who is just on a complete downward spiral there. Uh, but yeah, they just have played so many quality games, and that's why, I mean, they probably deserve to be in the rankings last week, and they definitely deserve to jump back in here. So yeah, I had them at 20. But along with that, Oregon is red hot, 3-0 this past week, swept Arizona at Arizona, and 9 straight wins now against decent teams for the most part, and the offense is absolutely red hot with pitching a little bit lackluster at times, but that's kind of what the team you expect at the beginning of the season looked like. And then for me, where we differ here, West Virginia went 3-1. They're 21-7 overall. They beat Kansas State at Kansas State, who's a decent team in the Big 12 this year. They haven't West Virginia haven't played top tier teams so far this year, but they've just put together a decent season altogether so far, and deserved, for me personally, to get in the rankings at this point, with a lot of teams at the bottom end just little like teetering around that 25 spot.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's definitely tough. West Virginia was one of the teams I was considering moving in. Was going back and forth between them and NC State. A couple others were in consideration as well, but yeah, West Virginia was definitely one of those teams I was considering. Um, did you have Miami in your 20 spot then?
Yeah, I did.
I'm fine with that because I had them in my 21 spot.
Okay. And then you have Texas A&M still in the rankings, correct?
Correct. They are my 25.
Okay, so staying at 25 from last week to this week. I don't
Yep.
know. It's tough for me to keep them there after just another iffy week and now being at 11 wins with the rankings how they stand. The next closest is 9 wins, so having two more than the next team, I just don't think is really warranted. They're just, I don't know, up and down and just kind of not putting it all together, it seems like, and it's tough in the SEC, but I think there is definitely a top echelon of that league right now, and Texas A&M is just falling by the wayside as well as Missouri, kind of in that same spot where you're not proving it in a sense, and that's the reason why I kind of dropped them there.
Where did you left Texas Tech in, right?
Yeah, so I had Texas and Texas Tech staying in the same spot, 22 and 23. Uh, just because Texas beat Texas Tech the same or last week. So I just wanted to kind of keep that parity alive, especially because yeah, Texas did lose their weekend series and Texas Tech didn't, but Texas got a pretty solid midweek win against A&M and all their games were on the road, so kind of gave them a little leeway there. And yeah, I mean Texas Tech got a good weekend series against TCU, but TCU is struggling. They're not like the most healthy right now, and they're a team that if they get things going, then they can definitely be a ranked team like we saw earlier in the season, but they haven't put it all together like we saw at the very beginning. But yeah, so I just left them in the same spot and then had UCSB going all the way to 25, but I'm fine dropping UCSB. We could just drop UCSB and Texas A&M and have four new teams this week and just make it easy on ourselves there. But yeah, the order is definitely up for debate.
Yeah. So are you kind of thinking Miami, Oregon 2021?
Yeah, that's what I went with. Miami, Oregon, Texas, Texas Tech, West Virginia, UCSB. But if we
Okay.
take out UCSB, then we have a little bit of room to
Let's
operate there.
let's lock in those first four there. Miami,
Okay,
Oregon, Texas, Texas Tech.
sweet.
Yeah, I feel pretty good about Texas after this last week. Like you mentioned, playing tough competition and stuff. Normally, if a team is in this 21 to 25 range and they lose a series, they're going to be dropping out of the rankings. But personally, I felt better about Texas coming out of this week than maybe I did going into it, even though
Right.
they were on an absolute heater of a win streak. But I thought they were very competitive against tough competition, and I
Yeah.
thought they were really proving themselves. So,
Yeah, for sure. Like during that win streak, there weren't amazing quality wins, and they even though they went 2-2, they proved that they could compete with ranked teams, and yeah, and showed that there. So we have the 24 and 25 spot open for West Virginia and maybe NC State. I guess I don't know. I just thought they needed one more week for me personally to be ranked. If especially because they face ECU midweek and then Wake Forest on the weekend, so they have very tough competition, and then we're kind of up against that same thing where if they go 2-2, do they deserve to be ranked next week? I mean, for I think we can put NC State in, but if they go 2-2, then they're straight out again because they're just like teetering on the edge there. I mean, obviously this depends on how teams outside of the top 25 do, but I think NC State's ACC record isn't amazing right now. They've started to look better, definitely have upped their game, but they were pretty bad for a few weeks consecutively. And I don't know if this quick of a turnaround makes them jump into the top 25 for me.
yeah, no, it was tough. They're sitting at 20-8 overall, but 7 of those 8 losses are against ranked teams. So they may not necessarily have as many wins as you would like against those top opponents, but they're not really losing to teams that they shouldn't be losing to. They're taking
Right.
care of business most of the time, and then they've just struggled against the high end competition in the ACC. So, yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, it is tough to put them back in after just winning one series, but there's just a lot of teams that you can really nitpick anybody in this 24 through 30 range and pick things out of their resume that you don't like. So it's tough.
Yeah, I think it's fine to put NC State like at the back end at like 25 or something like that, but just to mention a few of those teams that kind of are right outside the rankings. For me, I mean TCU and Alabama have just kind of been there the entire year. They're facing good competition week out or week in week out for the most part, and they just keep going like 2-2 or winning against bad teams and losing against the better teams for the most part. Also, another team outside the rankings, Oregon State. They went 4-0 this past week. They swept at Washington, which was a team that was right on the outside looking in. So Oregon State's put together a good few weeks after a tough start to the beginning of conference play for them, and they face Oregon this week. So definitely a matchup to look out for, with Oregon State potentially jumping into the rankings if they can prove it there. And then there are a few mid majors like UTSA and UConn that are right outside. A lot of rankings have teams like that in right now, with a lot of these Power 5 teams struggling this past week. But I just wasn't too confident putting them in, but they're right there.
Yeah, another team I had right on the outside was Maryland after winning that series against Iowa. Uh,
Definitely.
a team that we had highly ranked to start the year, but just really struggled against a really tough schedule early on. So they have a lot of losses, most of them to good teams, but still waiting for them to kind of solidify themselves. And if they continue to play well and play at the level that we thought they could sort of be at coming into the year, they can certainly work their way back in the upcoming weeks. And two more teams that I kind of had in consideration. I don't think they have the resume at this point, but USC and Arizona State have both started off very hot in Pac 12 play. Don't really have notable series wins besides the USC over Stanford one, but still the overall resume lacks for quality wins. But those are two teams where if you're going to be at the top of a conference like that, eventually you're going to work your way into the rankings if you continue to win.
Yeah, definitely. They've both started out very well with conference play, but they didn't have the best non-conference schedule and weren't able to get amazing wins there, and their record just didn't look great overall before that. And like you mentioned, they haven't faced a lot of the better teams, maybe a few in conference play, but yeah, if they can just keep going, they definitely have a chance to make it up there if they can win against the better teams in the conference.
Yeah. So should we go West Virginia 24 and NC State 25 to round this out?
Yep, sounds good. And then a little caveat with NC State: if they go 2-2, they don't deserve to be ranked next week. But yeah, and then we'll do a quick rundown of the top 25. The Week 7 college baseball top 25 goes as follows: 25 NC State, West Virginia, Texas Tech, Texas, Oregon, Miami at 20, UCLA, Coastal Carolina, East Carolina, Florida Gulf Coast, Louisville at 15, UNC, Oklahoma State, Campbell, Stanford, Kentucky at 10, Tennessee at 9, Boston College 8, Virginia at 7, South Carolina 6, Arkansas 5, Florida 4, Vandy 3, Wake Forest 2, and LSU still at that number 1 spot.